I first noticed the calls a week after my father died. They came late at night, always at the same time, 2:17 a.m. My phone would ring, the screen displaying unknown caller. At first I ignored it, blaming it on spam or a wrong number. But the calls didn't stop. If anything, they became more insistent. When I finally answered, there was no voice on the other end, just silence. Not the kind of static-filled silence you get with a bad connection. This was absolute suffocating. I hung up, convinced it was just a glitch. But something about it unsettled me. By the fourth night, I started to feel like someone was watching me. The calls weren't random, they were intentional. And though the caller never spoke, I felt certain of one thing. Whoever it was, they knew me, and somehow, I knew them too. The calls became part of my nightly routine. Each time, the phone would ring at 2:17 a.m. sharp. Each time, I would answer, and each time, there was nothing but silence. The kind of silence that pressed against your eardrums and made you question if you were really alone. On the sixth night, I stayed up, determined to see if the number would show up again. I sat in the dark with my phone on the coffee table, staring at the clock. When 2:17 a.m. came, the phone lit up. Unknown caller. My heart raced as I answered. Hello? My voice wavered. Silence. Who is this? I asked, louder now. Silence. I waited, the silence stretching thin, and then, just as I was about to hang up, I heard it. A faint sound, like a breath catching. It wasn't much, but it was enough to send a shiver down my spine. Someone was there. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, I scrolled through my call log, trying to trace the number, but there was nothing. No record of the call. Desperate for answers, I went to my father's house. It had been empty since his death, a time capsule of his final days. I searched through his belongings, looking for, I wasn't sure what. A clue, a connection. That's when I found the phone. His old landline, disconnected for years, was sitting on his desk. Its receiver was slightly off the hook. A chill ran through me as I lifted it. The dial tone was faint, almost imperceptible, but it was there. And in that moment, I felt it. A presence heavy and familiar, like my father's shadow lingering in the room. I left my father's house in a daze, clutching the old phone in my hands. It shouldn't have worked. The line had been disconnected years ago. And yet, the faint dial tone hummed like a heartbeat. That night, I set the phone on my kitchen table and stared at it. When 2:17 a.m. came, my cell phone rang again. I let it ring this time, my eyes fixed on the landline. The moment the ringing stopped, the landline clicked softly, as if someone had picked it up. Hello? My voice cracked as I spoke into the receiver. The silence on the other end was different now, closer, heavier, like someone was leaning into the line. Is this you? I whispered, unsure of who I was even addressing. My father? A stranger? Myself? And then a sound, a faint rhythmic tapping. It was slow and deliberate, like someone drumming their fingers on a desk. My father used to do that when he was deep in thought. I froze, my mind racing. Dad? I asked, my voice barely audible. The tapping stopped. I felt a lump rise in my throat. What do you want? I asked, gripping the receiver so tightly my knuckles ached. The silence returned, deeper now, and then the line went dead. When I set the phone down, my cell phone buzzed with a text message. My heart dropped when I saw it. Do not ignore me. There was no sender, no number, just the message stark against the screen. I tried calling the number back, but it didn't exist. The only thing I could do was wait for 2:17 a.m. to come again. By the 10th night, I was unraveling. I hadn't slept in days. My apartment was a mess. Half-empty coffee cups littered the table, and my walls were covered in sticky notes with scribbled theories. Was this some cruel prank? A hallucination? Or something worse? I was certain of one thing. The calls were tied to my father. He'd always been a secretive man, keeping parts of himself hidden even from me. After his death, I discovered dozens of locked drawers and boxes filled with old photographs and letters, none of which I had the courage to open. Until now. I sat on the floor of my father's house, surrounded by his things. One box in particular caught my eye. It was small and unassuming, locked with a brass latch. It took me a while to pry it open, but when I did, I wished I hadn't. Inside were photographs of me, taken without my knowledge. I was younger in some, older in others, but in every photo I was alone, reading, walking, sitting at a cafe, and in the background of every image there was the same figure, a man with a blurred face watching. My hand shook as I flipped through the photos. The last one stopped me cold. It was recent, taken just weeks ago. In it, I was sitting in my apartment, staring at my phone. Behind me, standing in the doorway, was the same blurred figure. The landline on the desk buzzed, its receiver rattling against the wood. I jumped, my heart pounding. Slowly, I picked it up. This time, the silence was punctuated by something new. A voice. It was faint, distorted, like a radio signal barely in range. "Why didn't you tell me?" "Tell you what?" I whispered, tears stinging my eyes. The voice grew louder, angrier. "You knew. You always knew." The line went dead. As I turned to leave, my phone vibrated. Another message, "You can't run from this." I didn't reply. I couldn't, because deep down, I knew it was true. I barely made it through the night. I couldn't sleep, couldn't think, couldn't stop staring at the phone on the table. Every sound felt amplified, the creak of the floorboards, the hum of the fridge, the faint ticking of the clock. But none of it compared to the suffocating silence when the phone rang again. 2:17 a.m. sharp. I didn't answer this time. Instead, I watched the phone vibrate on the table, its screen lighting up the dark room. When it finally stopped, I exhaled shakily, thinking it was over. But then, the landline rang. The sound was deafening in the quiet apartment, shrill and insistent. My hand hovered over the receiver, dread pooling in my stomach. I picked it up. The voice was back, clearer this time. "You lied to me." It was my father's voice, unmistakable, but it wasn't warm or familiar. It was cold, accusing. "Dad?" I whispered. My throat felt tight. "What do you mean? I didn't lie to you." "You did," he hissed. "And now they know." "Who knows?" I asked, my voice rising. The line crackled and the tapping returned, rhythmic and deliberate. Then, just before the line went dead, he said something that chilled me to my core. "Check the door." The room felt impossibly small. As I turned toward my apartment door, my heart pounded in my chest, and for a moment I thought I was imagining it. But then I heard it. A faint knock, barely audible but unmistakable. I stayed frozen, my breath catching in my throat. The knock came again, louder this time. Slowly I approached the door, every step feeling like a death sentence. "Who's there?" I called, but there was no response. When I finally opened the door, the hallway was empty. No one was there, just silence. But as I stepped back inside, I saw it. A figure stood in the reflection of the window across the room, its face obscured but unmistakably watching me. I spun around, but there was no one there. The phone buzzed again. This time the message was simple. "You can't hide forever." The messages didn't stop. Neither did the calls. Each night at 2:17 a.m., my phone would light up, dragging me deeper into the spiral. The voice on the landline grew clearer, more insistent, as if my father was trying to tell me something I didn't want to hear. "You need to remember," he said one night. "They won't stop until you do." "Remember what?" I shouted, my voice cracking. But the line went dead, as always. The next morning, I returned to his house. The place felt darker than before, as if his absence had left behind a vacuum that the light couldn't fill. I went straight to his study, determined to find answers. That's when I noticed the journal. It sat on his desk, its cover cracked and faded. I'd missed it the first time, buried under a pile of papers. I flipped it open, my hands trembling. The entries were fragmented, scattered thoughts and scribbles, but one page stood out. "He's always watching. I tried to tell her, but she won't listen. They don't believe me. But he knows I know, and he's coming for her. The next entry was dated just days before my father's death. It's too late. I've locked the door, but he's already inside. She has to know the truth. She has to remember. The pages after that were blank. I sat back, my heart racing. Who was he? What did my father mean by inside? The phone on the desk buzzed suddenly, making me jump. I answered it without thinking. "You brought him here," the voice said, my father's voice, but distorted, like it was coming from underwater. "You invited him in." I slammed the phone down, panic clawing at my chest. The walls seemed to close in around me, shadows creeping closer. I turned toward the door, but it was already open, and standing in the doorway was the figure. It didn't move, didn't speak, it just watched, its face obscured, its presence suffocating. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. The last thing I heard before everything went black was the phone ringing again. I woke up on the floor of my father's study, the room dark and suffocatingly still. My head throbbed, and my limbs felt heavy, like I'd been dragged under water and left to drown. The phone on the desk buzzed faintly, its glow casting flickering shadows across the room. The figure was gone. At least, that's what I told myself. But the feeling of being watched lingered, pressing on my chest like a weight I couldn't shake. I stumbled to my feet, gripping the edge of the desk for balance. The phone buzzed again. "Enough," I said through gritted teeth, grabbing it. "Who are you? What do you want?" Silence. Then the voice, faint but distinct. "You know who I am. You let me in." "No," I snapped, my voice trembling. "You're lying." The voice grew sharper. "You invited me. You called me back." I slammed the phone down, my breathing ragged. The words didn't make sense until they did. My stomach churned as the pieces clicked into place. The email, the call. I had answered them. I had opened the door. The landline crackled behind me. Slowly, I turned to face it. The receiver was off the hook, though I hadn't touched it. From the speaker came a sound, a faint rhythmic tapping. My father's tapping. "Dad?" I whispered, stepping closer. The tapping stopped. The room seemed to hold its breath, and then the voice returned, distorted, overlapping itself, as if two people were speaking at once. "Run." A loud crash shattered the silence. The study door slammed shut behind me, and the shadows in the room thickened, pooling like spilled ink. They twisted and writhed, reaching for me with tendrils of darkness. I grabbed the journal and bolted for the door, but it wouldn't budge. The shadows closed in, their presence cold and suffocating. Desperate, I turned to the window. It was cracked, the glass weak. I didn't think, I just threw myself through it. I hit the ground hard, the air knocked out of me. When I looked up, the house loomed dark and silent, its windows like empty eyes. The figure was gone. But I knew it wasn't over. I didn't go back to the house. Not that night. Not ever. I drove home in a daze, my father's journal clutched tightly in my hands. I couldn't stop shaking, replaying the events over and over in my mind. The calls didn't stop. Each night at 2:17 a.m., my phone rang. I stopped answering, but the silence was almost worse. I'd stare at the screen, heart pounding, waiting for it to stop, and every time it was followed by a message. Short, cryptic, mocking. "You can't escape, you know the truth. He's still watching." I burned the journal a week later. It didn't help. The shadow of my father's warnings lingered, etched into my mind like a scar. I saw the figure everywhere, in reflections, in the corner of my eye, in the spaces where shadows didn't belong. I tried telling someone once, a therapist. They called it grief, unresolved guilt, manifesting as hallucinations. But I know what I saw, what I felt. My father wasn't the only one keeping secrets, and now I was part of whatever this was. One night the messages stopped, the calls didn't come. For the first time in months I felt relief. But as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, I heard it. The faint rhythmic tapping. It was coming from inside the house. I live alone now. No phone, no internet, no mirrors. But the figure still finds me. It doesn't need technology. It's in the walls, the air, the silence. Sometimes I wonder if this is what my father endured, if he too had tried to warn me in his own fractured way. I wonder if he had ever escaped, or if escape was even possible. The tapping comes every night, soft but insistent, like a metronome counting down the seconds. I tell myself I won't look, won't listen, but I always do. And every night the figure is closer. It was supposed to be a fun tradition. Every year, a group of us would visit an abandoned location in the days leading up to Halloween. This year, the destination was Blackwood Asylum, a decrepit psychiatric hospital that had been shut down in the 1960s. It sat deep in the woods, its crumbling facade barely visible from the overgrown road that led to it. There were 5 of us: Ryan, the self-proclaimed leader; Claire, his girlfriend; Jackson, who always had a camera in hand; Megan, the skeptic; and me, the reluctant tag-along. The stories about Blackwood were well known in the area: patients disappearing, staff vanishing without a trace, and a mysterious fire that sealed its fate. None of us believed in ghosts, but as we walked up the cracked path toward the looming structure, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. The asylum was worse than I'd imagined. Its stone walls were blackened from decades of weathering, and vines crawled over its facade like veins on rotting flesh. The front doors hung ajar, creaking in the wind. Jackson snapped a photo, the flash illuminating the eerie emptiness inside. "Creepy, but not scary," Megan said, her voice echoing slightly. "Just an old building." Ryan led the way inside, the beam from his flashlight cutting through the darkness. The air was damp and smelled faintly of mold and something metallic. "This is where they kept the violent patients," Claire whispered, pointing to the rusted bars on the windows. As we moved deeper into the asylum, the temperature seemed to drop. Long hallways stretched into darkness, the walls lined with peeling paint and old medical posters. Jackson stopped to photograph an abandoned wheelchair, its shadow twisting in his camera's light. In one room, we found a stack of old patient files, their pages yellowed and brittle. Megan picked one up and read aloud. "Subject exhibits signs of paranoia and claims to hear voices from the light." She laughed nervously. "That's vague enough to apply to anyone." But then Claire found something even stranger: a lantern. It sat on the floor in the corner of the room, its glass intact and its metal polished, as if someone had placed it there recently. When she picked it up, the wick flickered to life, glowing faintly without any fuel. "That's not possible," she murmured. "Must be some kind of prank," Ryan said, though his voice sounded unsure. But as we stood there, staring at the lantern, the faint sound of footsteps echoed down the hallway behind us. We weren't alone. Ryan, ever the bold one, took the glowing lantern and led the way down the hall. "Probably just some squatters," he said, though his grip on the handle was tight. The rest of us followed, our footsteps hesitant. The hall stretched on forever, or at least it felt that way. Every door we passed was either locked or led to empty rooms. But the further we went, the stronger the glow from the lantern became, as if it was guiding us. "What's that smell?" Claire asked, wrinkling her nose. I smelled it too, something faintly sweet, like rotting fruit. We stopped at a large, rusted door at the end of the hallway. Scratched into its surface were words, barely legible. "The light will save you." "Creepy," Megan muttered, but Ryan pushed the door open without hesitation. The room beyond was massive, lined with rusted beds and broken medical equipment. At the center of the room was a pit, circular and wide, surrounded by faint scorch marks. The lantern's glow intensified, casting long shadows across the walls. "This is where the fire started," Jackson said, snapping a photo. His camera whirred, but when he checked the screen, the photo was black. "Weird," he murmured, taking another. Again, nothing but darkness. Suddenly the lantern flickered and the room plunged into shadow. "Turn it back on," Claire hissed, but Ryan just stared at the pit. "There's something down there," he said, his voice barely audible. We all froze. A faint whisper rose from the pit, soft at first, then louder. It was unintelligible, but the tone was urgent, almost pleading. "Let's go," Megan said, her voice shaking. But before we could leave, the lantern flared back to life, its light now harsh and blinding. And from the pit came a sound I'll never forget, a scream, long and anguished, echoing through the asylum. The scream faded, leaving a suffocating silence in its wake. The glow of the lantern dimmed to a faint pulse, its light throbbing in time with my racing heart. "We need to leave," Megan said, her voice trembling. "Not yet," Ryan insisted, staring at the pit. "There's something here, something calling us." "Calling you, maybe," Jackson snapped, gripping his camera tightly. "I'm not sticking around to find out what it wants." But as we turned to leave, the door slammed shut, the echo reverberating through the room. Claire screamed, and Jackson threw himself against the door, but it wouldn't budge. "What the hell is going on?" he yelled. Ryan raised the lantern, its light casting eerie patterns across the walls. "It's the lantern," he said, almost in awe. "It wants us to see something." "No," Megan snapped. "It's a trap. Whatever's down there, whatever caused that fire, it's not something we want to meet." The whispering started again, rising from the pit. It was louder now, more distinct, though the words were still impossible to understand. The sound was coming from everywhere and nowhere all at once. Claire pointed to the walls. "Look!" she cried. The shadows cast by the lantern weren't random. They were forming shapes, figures, dozens of them, all reaching toward the pit. Their faces were twisted in agony, mouths open in silent screams. The whispers grew louder, the figures moving in the flickering light. Ryan stepped closer to the pit, as if drawn by an invisible force. "Ryan, stop!" I shouted, grabbing his arm, but he shrugged me off, his eyes fixed on the swirling darkness below. "It's showing me something," he murmured. "Something I have to see." Before we could stop him, he knelt at the edge of the pit, holding the lantern over the abyss. Its glow intensified again, and for a moment I saw it too, a figure at the bottom of the pit. It was human-shaped but wrong, its limbs too long, its face featureless, and it was climbing. Ryan dropped the lantern as he scrambled back from the edge of the pit. The glass didn't shatter when it hit the floor. Instead, it flared once more, bathing the room in an eerie red glow. "It's coming!" he screamed, his voice breaking with panic. None of us needed to ask what it was. The figure was rising from the pit, its grotesque limbs pulling it closer and closer to the surface. Its movements were jerky, as though it was struggling against some unseen force. But it was relentless. Jackson yanked on the door again, slamming his shoulder into it until it finally gave way with a screech of protest. "Run!" he yelled, and we didn't need to be told twice. We bolted down the hallway, the lantern's glow still casting strange shadows behind us. The whispers had turned into a cacophony, a deafening roar of voices overlapping and screaming. The walls seemed to pulse and twist as we ran, like the asylum itself was alive and angry. "Where's the exit?" Claire cried, her voice cracking. But the hallways seemed to stretch on forever, twisting and looping back on themselves. It was as if the building was trapping us, forcing us back toward the pit. The temperature dropped sharply, and my breath came out in visible puffs. Behind us, I could hear the sound of scraping, long, deliberate drags, like nails on stone. I glanced back and saw it, crawling down the hallway toward us. Its featureless face seemed to focus on me, its limbs bending at impossible angles as it moved faster and faster. Megan tripped, falling hard to the ground. I turned to help her, but she screamed at me to go. "It's too late," she sobbed as the thing reached her, its grotesque limbs wrapping around her like a spider capturing its prey. Her screams cut off abruptly. We reached a door at the end of the hallway, but it was locked. Ryan held up the lantern, its light flaring again, revealing a key hanging on the wall nearby. He grabbed it and fumbled with the lock as the creature closed in. Ryan's hands were shaking so badly he nearly dropped the key. "Hurry!" Jackson shouted, his voice breaking as the scraping sound grew louder. I turned back and saw it, closer now, its spindly limbs dragging it forward. The glow from the lantern illuminated its featureless face, smooth and pale, as if it had been carved from wax. "I'm trying," Ryan yelled, finally jamming the key into the lock. The door creaked open just as the creature lunged. I shoved Jackson and Claire through, grabbing Ryan by the back of his jacket and dragging him inside. The door slammed shut behind us, and we pressed against it, panting and terrified. The room we'd stumbled into wasn't much better. It was small and circular, with walls covered in old, rusted chains. In the center was a hatch sealed with a massive padlock. "What is this place?" Claire whispered, her voice trembling. The whispers returned, softer this time, echoing around us like a sinister lullaby. The lantern's glow dimmed, its light flickering like a dying heartbeat. "We can't stay here," I said, but before anyone could respond, the chains on the walls began to rattle. The door behind us groaned, bending inward as if the creature were pushing against it. Ryan held the lantern high, the light flaring just enough to reveal words scrawled across the walls. "Do not open the hatch." "What's in there?" Jackson asked, his voice a hoarse whisper. "Who cares?" "We're not opening it," Claire snapped, but her words were drowned out by a deafening crash. The door exploded inward, and the creature crawled into the room, its limbs twisted unnaturally, its body contorting to fit through the narrow frame. "Move!" Ryan screamed, pulling open the hatch despite the warning. He didn't wait to see what was inside, he just jumped. Jackson and I followed without hesitation, and Claire, sobbing, came last. We fell into darkness, the sound of chains and whispers fading as we plummeted. When we hit the ground, the lantern flared one last time, revealing a long, dark tunnel. "Where does it lead?" Claire asked, her voice barely audible. "Anywhere but here," Ryan muttered, and we started running. The tunnel felt endless. The air was damp and the walls were slick with moisture. Every step echoed around us, making it impossible to tell if we were alone or being followed. Ryan clutched the lantern, its glow growing weaker with every passing minute. "We need to keep moving," he said, his voice tight with fear. Jackson stopped abruptly, holding up his hand. "Do you hear that?" We listened, and there it was, a faint sound, like breathing coming from somewhere up ahead. Ryan raised the lantern, and the glow revealed a figure standing in the distance. It was small and hunched, its back turned to us. "Who's there?" Ryan called, his voice cracking. The figure didn't move. Then, slowly, it turned to face us. Its eyes were hollow pits, and its mouth stretched into an impossibly wide grin. It raised a hand and pointed behind us. We turned, and the whispers came flooding back, louder than ever. Shadows filled the tunnel, twisting and writhing like living things. The creature from the asylum was there, its featureless face glowing faintly in the darkness. "Run!" I shouted, grabbing Claire's arm and pulling her forward. The figure in front of us didn't move as we barreled past, but I felt its cold gaze follow us. When we finally burst out into the open air, the sun was rising, the forest was quiet, the asylum nowhere in sight. We collapsed onto the ground, gasping for breath. "What was that?" Claire sobbed. None of us had an answer. Ryan threw the lantern into the trees, its glow finally extinguished. "We're not talking about this," he said. "Ever. It's been years since that night, but I can't forget. The whispers still haunt me, faint and insistent, especially when I'm alone." Ryan moved away, refusing to speak to any of us. Jackson burned every photo he took that night. Claire doesn't leave her house anymore. No one believes us, of course. They say Blackwood Asylum is just an old ruin, but we know better. The stories, the fire, the disappearances, it all ties back to that lantern, that pit, and whatever was climbing out of it. Sometimes I dream about the tunnel, about the figure that pointed behind us. I wonder what it was trying to warn us about, and if we ever truly escaped. The lantern's glow is gone, but the whispers remain, and I fear they always will.